Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Data Protection Day here by Computer World. My name is Barry Coombs, and we've got lots of great content for you throughout the day. Before we get on to the subject of this first initial session, just want to share some housekeeping with you, let you know how to make the most of today. So first of all, make sure you've gone and have a look at the schedule that we've put together. You can scan the QR code there, or you should have had the opportunity to add sessions when you signed up or by visiting the main event page now. There's lots of content on there, and even if you're not available to watch it live, make sure you go and add it to your agenda so you can then be reminded to watch that later when it's the most convenient for you to do so. Second of all, we're giving away a fantastic Oni pizza oven. And if, like myself, you're looking forward to spending more time with family, having to spend time out in the garden and looking forward to summer, the Oni pizza oven seems to be the just must-have thing to have at the moment. So all you've got to do to be in with a chance of winning is attend today, and you already are. That's fantastic. Go to the session that is around midday if you scan the QR code on screen, and that will give you the specific details as to how you can enter to be one of the people to win the Oni pizza oven that we're giving away. And then finally, if anything during the half-day conference has resonated with you, if you want to spend some time with one of our specialists, just kind of understanding how what we've shared with you would work for your organization, how we can best help you get into the right position for your organization to ensure that you're protected, to ensure that you've kind of done everything to mitigate a disaster happening, then again, scan the QR code, or there'll be some opportunities later on in the day to fill out feedback forms. We're giving away a complimentary data protection review. It's about an hour session with one of our specialists where we'll spend some time going through key information with how your organization is set up to best protect data, and then we can leave you with some best steps. There's no obligation, there's no cost for you. It just will allow us to spend some time, and then if we can help you with that, then that's all well and good. We can then follow up from there. So without any further ado, let's move on to the main subject of this session, which is all around our top 5 tips for data protection in 2021. And I want to bring on my co-host, Ben Evans, who is our technical architecture manager here at Computer World, who spends a lot of his time looking at infrastructure technology, virtualization, DR, cloud with Azure. So Ben, thank you ever so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Barry. Great introduction there. Thank you so much. So yeah, pleasure to be here and happy to talk about our top 5 subjects with you when it comes to DR and backup.
Fantastic. So first of all, before we dig into those sessions, the last year, the last 12 months has been very different for a number of reasons, but obviously one main reason that I think everyone's bored of hearing about now. So we're going to try not to mention that C word too much. But typically when we talk about working from home, when we talk about the changes of the last 12 months, we're talking about how that's affecting flexible working and working from home and end user technologies. What have you seen happen within the last 12 months when it comes to kind of data and data protection and infrastructure?
Well, the biggest thing that's really happened in the 12 months, apart from obviously the situation we're in, is everyone's digital transformation is had to accelerate to cope with the demands of working in a pandemic. So what this meant is businesses have had to adopt really quickly because their staff weren't able to get into the office. They had to work remotely. From advice from the government. So there's a lot of things that had to be done quickly to accommodate that. So what we're finding now is a lot of customers that I'm speaking to are in the process of perhaps just revisiting that or thinking about revisiting areas they need to look at. So for example, Microsoft Teams, I mean, we've seen it ourselves here. There was a massive rollout of that. It's got so many good features that have helped with this remote working during this pandemic. But what it's meant is people are now putting their data into Microsoft's cloud, whereas before all these files would have been on the file server, on the LAN. They would have been protected by the backup policies in place on the corporate network. But now they've gone outside that boundary. It's kind of looking at, well, what are we doing now to protect that data? Is it protected? Could we recover if there's an incident or problem with that data? So it's about understanding how we've rapidly had to change the ways we work to accommodate the situation that we're in, and just making sure all the best practices and all the policies are now aligned to what we need to be doing in this new age.
Definitely, it's all around this kind of fragmentation of data that we kind of were already talking about, the fact that data kind of was all in the data center, was all locked away. But with public cloud coming, it's causing fragmentation. But what we've seen over that last 12 months is people reacting to needing to do something overnight. And quite rightly, I think we can only celebrate the achievements that technical professionals have pulled off in the last 12 months, 3 years worth of innovation within the initial month alone. But the problem is it was very much a reaction. It wasn't a planned, methodic change from one way to another. So it's been a really big change. And I think this kind of brings us to our point number one of our kind of points that we want to go over as the 5 points for 2021, which is know what you're trying to protect and what you are protecting against. So Ben, what are your initial thoughts on this first tip?
So I'm going to flip it up a bit here, and I'm going to start with the second point, is what we're trying to protect against. So this is really important to me. What we used to say is, when we're talking about backup and DR, we always used to protect against fire in flood and natural disaster. And if you're American, it'd be earthquakes and tornadoes and hurricanes and all of those kind of things that we fortunately don't get over here. But the biggest one, and this is what I've seen in a lot of our customers that have happened, and we've helped them recover from this, but have been ransomware attacks, where there's not been actually anything wrong with the physical tin or the kit that they've got on site. It's functional, but all the data on it's been encrypted, which means all the applications are lost, they're offline. Users can't access what they need to do their work, and the businesses are being held to ransom. So that's a real big problem we've got in the industry at the moment. And that is the highest priority when it comes to sort of disaster recovery and backup. So if you're not thinking about protecting yourself from ransomware and what you need to do to mitigate those risks, then that should be really the top priority.
Definitely. I think that's really important. There's been a couple of projects that I've worked upon, and one of them, the person that was in charge of it was an ex-naval officer, and he had a very succinct list of things that he wanted to talk to us about as to how would we protect against this, how would we protect against that. And one of those was localized nuclear disaster was one of the elements he wanted us to think about. Now he did have his reasons why that was valid, but equally it's about kind of getting to a list that matters to your organization, not taking it to the nth degree, but just thinking of those different scenarios. And certainly I have had customers that are based at airfields. So the plane crashing through the roof, which is always the nightmare scenario that we seem to go to. For some organizations, that's a lot more realistic than others, maybe.
Exactly. I'm just thinking about war games now, and was it Whopper, wasn't it? The program that used to run to simulate those attacks. But really where we need to start with is just revisiting, if you haven't got one already, revisiting the service catalog. So basically creating that central document of what you as an IT department and a business, what applications have you got, what services do you provide, where's your data held? And it's about bringing all of that together into a single location so you can start to build that initial plan. And then once you've got that, it's kind of understanding about, okay, I've got all this data and information, and start to classify it. Where is it held? What's personal identifiable information for GDPR compliance and things like that. Try not to fall into the trap of, I've got my data in the cloud, so I don't need to worry about backing it up or protect it anymore, because unfortunately that's not true. There's a few instances recently where there's been a disaster at a cloud provider and people have lost years worth of work because they didn't have a DR or a backup in place, because they may or may not have wrongly assumed that, oh, it's in the cloud, it's the cloud provider's problem now, not mine. So starting with that service catalog is always key for any form of backup and DR projects in my mind.
Definitely, and it's kind of the consideration that you put into that and how you gather the information for that. And it kind of comes on to the next point a little bit, is most people kind of, when you ask them how much downtime can an application tolerate, how much data can you afford to lose, the answer is very quickly, well, we can't afford to lose anything. So we always make sure we align those questions into something such as, well, what is the maximum tolerable data loss? What is the maximum tolerable downtime? It's at what point does your business go out of business because of something that is happening from that perspective. But the only way you can get to those figures is the involvement from the business, isn't it? Engaging with the business.
Absolutely. And it's wrongly assumed that DR and backup are an IT project. It's not. It's a business related project. The way I think of it is IT provide and responsible for keeping the services up and running, but they need direction and they need input back from the business to say, what is it we need to adhere to? What are our SLAs? So with those defined and input from the business, then you come to that middle ground of an affordable solution that gives you realistic RPOs and RTOs for what you can invest in technology. Because there are solutions out there that can give you, zero data loss and zero downtime, but they've also got a lot more zeros in, usually on the end of the quote. And what we find is, okay, we need to get to that situation where it's agreed with the business that this is what we're willing to tolerate, and then we can work backwards from that. And usually we find that good middle ground. But it's also understand what the business priorities are, and making sure they're captured, because sometimes IT can make assumptions about things and get things wrong. So a good place to start with that is, what is the cost of downtime to your organization? So I did this in my previous company. So I worked in a law firm and trying to get sign off for a DR project. The finance director did this. He's like, for every hour that the IT systems are offline, the solicitors, the fee earners could not bill X amount of pounds. And this is what it cost to the business. And that was the business case used in that situation to get that project across the line. So if you're able to do that, not all businesses are, but that's a good start to work out where we're going to invest the money and what risks we need to take or accept when we're doing these types of projects.
Definitely. I think it's a really good question around that. What is the cost to your business? And you find that people like professional services organizations or manufacturing organizations find it very easy to quantify that. Retail would be another one that find that easy to quantify, but definitely work with the finance director to understand that out. So I think as we move on to number 2 then, for me, leveraging the inherent security and protection features that are built into the products is something that I think can easily be overlooked. When we're talking to customers, it's around being able to, well, what products do I need to improve protection? What services do I need to subscribe to make sure that things are more secure? And for me, often when I'm speaking to customers around this, maybe some of the things that they're already paying for, that are already available as part of products or services they're subscribing to, aren't already being utilized.
So I'm a great fan of a layered approach when it comes to backup and DR. The more functionality and the more features you can use within the product sets you've got, the better. Now, on balance, you need to make sure it doesn't get overly complicated that you don't really know what you're doing. But certainly things like, let's take virtualization, for example, that solved a lot of challenges because we can have things like HA in place. So if we have a hardware failure, then we can use vSphere HA to restart that VM on another host. That mitigated a lot of issues and a lot of risks when it comes to, restoring from backup or finding a server the exact same spec. But other features like SAN snapshots are really important when it comes to protecting your data. What we want to do is make sure that when we're backing it up, we're also using things like SAN snapshots to cover that gap between the backup windows. So it's not always possible to run continual backups. So taking advantage of the snapshots can also save you bacon, especially when it comes into ransomware. We can roll back to a known good state. Other things to consider, like just having good basics, really, when it comes to things like network security, making sure you're following those best practices, making sure you're locking down your network, locking down access to the data. So if people don't need delete access, make sure they've got that right level of access so they can't delete those important files. And it's just those good basics, a layered approach, just mitigates a lot of those risks.
Definitely, Ben. And I think what I've seen with regard to things like those SAM protection snapshots and things like that customers that have ended up having problems really could have mitigated what then happens next if they would have had those in place.
Yeah, definitely.
So there's other examples, though, isn't there? Things like the network layer, the components that you invest in when you're building your core network and the wider network, the connection out to the WAN. All of those areas often have advanced features that out of the box, maybe they're not going to offer you full protection other than the basic firewall functionality or the basic switching functionality. That there's really, with a bit of focus looking at those systems, you can use those to further segment and protect your network as well.
Absolutely, and it comes to mitigating that risk again. That the more you can do to protect yourself using the technology you've got available, and like you say, that the features that are already there, the better and the more secure your environment's going to be, and the more your data is protected.
Definitely. So if we move on then, so we've understand the data that we're trying to protect. We've classified it. We understand what we're trying to protect it against. We've considered actually what is already available to us today, taking into consideration that layered approach, as you mentioned. It is good to have technologies from different vendors and things like that. But equally, we want to make sure we are maximizing the investment in the technologies we've got. So when we're then considering the options for data protection and practices, what would your recommendations be? I think this is an area where people can kind of go, well, we've got a firewall, we're doing that, we've considered this, why do I need to reconsider it? But times do change, as we've discussed at the beginning. It's probably a good time to kind of review and reflect.
Absolutely. And if you look at the industry and what vendors, like backup and data protection software vendors have done, is they've had to evolve as well. So my approach and the approach of Computer World is obviously we use the right tool to solve the challenge of the business rather than just do technology for technology's sake. But let's take Veeam, for example. So everyone's familiar with Veeam. It's Veeam backup and replication used to protect your VMs. Well, that was great. When everything was in the data center, we could easily roll out Veeam and we could use it to protect our data, replicate it elsewhere, job done. But Office 365 sort of come along, people start to move their emails into the Office 365 cloud suite, Azure public cloud, AWS public cloud. They've all come about now, and Veeam have had to adapt and create products for these services. So for example, they do a product then to back up 365 data, so email, files, SharePoint, Teams, all the information that's held in there. When we're moving workloads to public cloud, for example, such as Azure or AWS or Google Cloud, they've got products to solve the backup challenges when your data is hosted in those platforms. And even modern technology, everyone talks about Kubernetes these days, but they've got a Kubernetes native platform now to back up Kubernetes workloads. So they constantly have to adapt, which means things change, recommended practices change. So you just need to make sure that you're constantly revisiting the setup and the configuration of your backup and DR solutions to make sure they still fit the needs of your business, because IT changes very quickly. So what was done 5 years ago, and if you think about this in a life cycle, typically most customers will do a 5-year life cycle. You need to constantly revisit that throughout that life cycle just to make sure you're ticking all those boxes still. And actually you've not forgotten about something that's then been moved elsewhere, but it's really key and really critical to your business.
Definitely. I think people often review something at a time of implementation, maybe at a time a virtual environment has gone in, for example, and implement a solution at that given time, and then are happy to sit back and go, we've considered that. Until the virtual infrastructure is getting reviewed, we're not going to do anything again. They may have looked at replicating to the cloud at the time, but it was too expensive. But often when you dig a little bit deeper, ask if that expense, if that cost was based upon how a technology worked at a specific time. Was it based upon having a tiered system and knowing what data needs to replicate? Was it based on having business insight as to how much the cost would be for relevant downtime? Often these kind of things with a little bit of insight, a little bit of looking at, will come out with a different answer. And as you say, things like 365 are now meaning that the answer may be different. A tool that does work very well for your traditional workloads may need to change, may need to be a different tool. But ultimately, like in the example of Veeam, it's about actually looking how that tool could further support you in that ever-changing environment, rather than completely ditching it and going for a new product. In terms of some basics to be considering when going for data protection options, they always used to talk about sort of a 3-2-1 backup strategy, which I know we've spoken about before, and it's potentially come a long way. Have you got any specific thoughts around some basics that people should be considering for backup and where it needs to go, and what that basic configuration, that basic standard should look like?
Yeah, so the 3-2-1 is a great example of evolution. So everyone's familiar with 3 copies of your data, 2 different media types, one of which being offsite. But that's kind of now evolved. It doesn't flow as off the tongue as well, but it's now the 3-2-1-1-0. So the extra one on the end is having one of those backups air gapped, so completely segregated from your network, so that if there were a ransomware attack or a rogue admin, someone's dissatisfied and want to do some destruction before they leave, they can't get access to that backup data. It's secured in another tenant, isolated from your network. So we work closely with Ireland to provide these solutions using Veeam Cloud Connect. Sam Woodcott's got a great session on this this morning, so I'd highly recommend you watch that session to find out more about the importance of having that offsite air-gapped copy of your data. And the 0 on the end is all about the testing of your backups to make sure that they're valid. We'll talk about testing a little bit more in the next point, but I just want to talk about going back to 365 data, Barry. A question I get asked so many times is, I don't need to back up my 365 data. Microsoft say that you can put policies in place to DLP policies and all those sorts of things, so you don't technically have to back it up. That may or may not be true. I'm going to say I'm not a subject matter expert on this by any means, but for me, if I'm thinking back to when I was an admin and someone would delete a file by mistake, they want that data back quickly, as fast as possible. So from an admin point of view, I want that process to be easy. I don't want to have to go into Microsoft's portals or run PowerShell scripts or try and figure out where that data's held. For me, I just want peace of mind. I just want something that I can go in, log into a console, find that data using a good search facility, and then just restore it back to where it was before. Now, having a service we partner with Ireland, so as I mentioned before, having a backup service of 365 where you can do that and go and restore those files, mailboxes, Teams sites, SharePoint repositories, whatever it may be, with a few clicks of a button is just invaluable to me as an admin. So that's my approach with it. It's like not necessarily whether you should or shouldn't back up 365 data. It's just having that peace of mind to make sure that I can recover that data if the worst were to happen to it.
Definitely. As you say, it's about having those options, isn't it? And the way I like to think about the Microsoft Cloud is they talk quite often about their shared responsibility model, the bits they take responsibility for and the bits you do. And for me, my approach to being an IT administrator, someone that is responsible for IT, is always to have the slipperiest shoulders in town. I always want to have had enough in place to make sure if the worst does happen, I am able to completely demonstrate the steps and the actions that I have taken. Clearly, I hope in doing that I will never have to come to it, but I would never want something to come to me where it's clear that I haven't considered something. And for me, that layered approach to protection, you've moved it from one place to another. Yes, there will be some inbuilt functionality, but long-term archival, ease of recovery and things like that are really important when it comes to your data protection strategy. So a question that I get asked quite often, and I think that is relevant to this third point, is I've got backup in place, why do I need DR? Or if I go for DR, do I still need backup? What are your thoughts around sort of offsite backup and DR, and what is the difference and why do you need both?
Okay, a few questions in there. Offsite backup for me is not really optional these days. It should be your number one requirement, having that copy of your data offsite, that's secured, air gap for the reasons we've already discussed. That's really the number one priority. When it comes to backup and DR, there's just slightly different things, there's slightly different terminologies. It's important to remember they both form part of business continuity, so keeping the business running and providing those applications and services. So the way I usually think about it is backup is about having that secondary or multiple copies of your data in different locations. Typically with backups, they're driven by retention policies. So you've got requirements for how long you need to keep the data for. And when there's an issue or you need to recover it, you can just go to that secondary copy and put it back into where it needs to go in the primary location. But for most businesses, just having a copy of your data isn't enough. So DR is, the way I think about DR is it's a process. So it's a process to recover your critical IT services if the worst were to happen. So yes, by all means, there's a big technical element to it, and we can talk in depth about replication technologies and RPOs and RTOs and all of that. But it's just coming back to that service catalog. It's important to involve the business. So understand what the business requirements are and document it all. So document and fully understand how long these services can be down for. And then build out a DR plan that involves everyone in the organization, all the key stakeholders that you need to notify, and build that policy. Now, typically the differentiator from a sort of technical standpoint is DR typically doesn't have that long-term retention. I'm starting to see now there are products on the market that blends the two together, but under the hood, they're using different storage technologies. With backup, it's usually slower to restore, but you get longer history. With DR, it's quicker recovery times, but you don't go back. You haven't got that history typically in most solutions. And why you need both, really they complement each other. So they've each got sort of a different use case, a different requirement, but they're all part of that solution to protect the business and protect the data and the applications that you're providing.
Definitely. I think you're obviously you're completely right there, but it is that tying that back to what you need. And there are products out there that are claiming to be able to do both in one, or you don't need one because you've got the other. And I think the question shouldn't be, well, yes, I've got this tool, so I've got that, or the point shouldn't be that. It's almost actually, so what do you need? And does it actually tick all the boxes you need? I've seen sort of solutions that take your backups straight to the cloud, no need to have it on premises, which is a really good solution for some people. But if your DR strategy then is to recover from said backup quickly and easily, you've got to ask yourself, how quickly can I get that data back? And do I need a local copy to allow me to recover that more quickly? So it's all about getting that right mix of those technologies when you're considering those options to make sure you've got everything in place that you need to. Anything on point 3 then, Ben, before we move on to our point 4?
I think we've covered everything.
Fantastic. So point number 4 then was test, and test again. I probably added a few more tests in there from when we spoke about it, Ben, but certainly from my perspective, in all the many years I've been speaking to customers around data protection, is I always warn my customers that no matter how good a solution we put in for you today, no matter how much we consider it, no matter how much we do an initial test for you, it is only as good as the last time you've tested it. And then the length of the time since the last time you tested it, you should be getting nervous that something has changed from that point. So testing, I think, is one of the most important elements in this. Definitely.
And it's also understanding what you're testing as well. I remember going back more years than I care to remember, but part of the scripted test that I was told to run when I was a junior admin back in the day was every month I would restore the same files share or file data from the same server, from the backup exec tape to the same server. And it's just, okay, that's not really a realistic test, is it? So nowadays, it's just understanding what those critical applications and services are, making sure you're testing them regularly to make sure they can be restored. So like you already mentioned, Barry, you're only as good as your last backup. So making sure you haven't got any errors in that backup is really key. And like I say, with the technologies out there, there are automated ways of doing that and making sure that, yes, once the backup's run and completed, you can then validate it straight away to know that it's a sound backup and it will work. But you can never have too many tests in a title. Testing and documentation are the two most important things for me. So when it comes to DR, depending on the solution you've got, most what I call traditional, typical DR solutions will allow you to do non-disruptive testing, which is almost as good as the real thing. You should automate DR where possible. So there's another key question I get asked here quite a lot when we talk about automation is, in my mind, DR, when you invoke DR, that's always a manual process. That should always be done by humans. Someone should make the decision to do that because of obviously the ramifications out there. But you should automate that process as much as possible. So use technology to automatically restore the virtual machines or the workloads in whatever place they may be needed. Because if you think about a DR event, if you are in a DR event, you're going to be under immense pressure from the IT, as an IT person, from senior management that we say, when's this going to be back? When's this going to be back? And we're all humans, we make mistakes. So we don't want a big, massive, complicated run book that says, click this, press that, do this, because it's just going to go wrong. So I'm a massive fan of automating where possible. Other key things when it comes to DR is involve the stakeholders in the testing process. So the application owners in the business that have dictated we need these services up for this amount of time. When you're doing that test, make sure you're involving those and getting them to sign it off. So a lot of DR solutions and technologies will do a recovery report for you. So get them to sign the recovery report to say, yeah, I'm happy that this run on this date and everything was okay.
Definitely, and I think these kind of tests go further than just backup and DR. If you're kind of leveraging some of those inherent security features, like, I don't know, DLP that you might be using inside 365, or maybe you used AIP to encrypt documents at the stage before you would even need to recover anything, just test to make sure it's doing what you think it should be doing. More often than not, and I've spoken to customers that have purchased a piece of security software or a piece of security hardware, and actually the thought process begins and ends with, what do we need? This is the thing we need. Is that thing installed? Fantastic. And then they get someone to come in and do a penetration test, and they actually find that the security product they've installed, because it hasn't been fully configured, is actually the weakness in the system that allows the system to be mitigated in itself. And we've all heard of those disasters of like a network access control device being added to a network or something like that. Great, we've got that thing ticked off now, great. But that was misconfigured, and it actually introduced a way to then get into the network from that perspective.
Definitely. And documentation, like I mentioned just now, testing and documentation, two key things for me. Just, it's really important to make sure you're understanding and documenting what happened in that DR test, because sometimes things go wrong, VMs or services get missed, or they think workloads changed. But make sure you're dealing with those errors or processes that happen, to say, okay, we've highlighted this in our test, we need a resolution plan, and then rerun the test again, just to make sure that you get that successful test. And the final part is obviously the lessons learned. If there's anything to understand from that DR test that we could have done better, is it coming back within our agreed SLAs? Data growth especially is a problem. Data sets are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which means, you know, the time to recover those workloads are also growing. Are we still maintaining those recovery time objectives? So can we still get the service back up and running within that agreed time frame?
Definitely. And for me, again, it comes down to that bit of making sure that we've done everything that we can do. Normally, when you're audited for anything like this, what people are looking for, what organizations are looking for, is continual improvement. The ability to know that you constantly baseline yourself. You constantly just think, actually, is this still meeting the needs for the original reason that it was put in? Often that it's kind of, okay, we identified these challenges. This is what we're going to do to overcome these challenges, and then look to be able to see in the next test actually what the result was of that. So I think it's important you do all that. Ben, if someone was asking you, how often should I test? Let me pick one, DR. What generally is your response, other than, well, how long's a piece of string? What feels comfortable for you in terms of a DR test strategy?
Oh, I always give the consultants answer, Barry. It depends.
It depends.
Yeah, gel-free cut. No, I would say these days most organizations should be doing a quarterly test, to be honest with you. And I know that's not possible for a lot of organizations. It does depend on the size. With the right technology and the right processes in place, you should be able to do that on a quarterly basis quite seamlessly. Because, like I say, the testing process is usually all non-disruptive anyway. At a bare minimum, if you've got very basic DR setup and backups, you should be doing that once a year as a bare minimum.
Definitely. And I think, to go back to our first point, it's important that when you are doing your test, you are considering what are you actually testing. Because again, more often than not, the only thing that is tested is that complete disaster scenario. We're going to replicate all, well, it's one of two things. It's either we're going to recover everything to another site and make sure that works, or it's we're going to recover a file or a single server and make sure that works. Just think about those recovery scenarios. Think about when you're going to have to recover. one of the hardest things can be a partial recovery, recovering sort of half of your systems, with half of them running in one place and half of them running in another place. So just make sure you vary your testing. Don't kind of stick to something the same every time. Maybe test different things. I completely agree with quarterly. As ever, I would encourage customers to try and do it more than quarterly. But to be realistic, I completely agree with that answer. So as we move on to point 5 now, we kind of, just to recap, we've spoke there about kind of what it is that you're protecting against, what it is that you're protecting, what tools do you already have in place that you could be leveraging, what your consideration for third-party tools, and how could you modify your practices to make sure that you're mitigating and best protecting against disaster. We're then going to test it all the time, but then hopefully before disaster comes, maybe this should have been point number 4 rather than point number 5, but it's part of the mix. It's actually, how are you going to plan for when the disaster happens? What should you be doing from that perspective? So Ben, I think there's 2 things I want to talk about specifically here, but let's talk about some common areas first. So what should a DR runbook look like? What should a data protection or data recovery runbook look like? And what are your advice in those areas?
Well, the starting point is just think about where you're going to store this document as well. That's really important, because you don't want to be storing it next to your servers, because if there are a fire or a flood or something like that, then your runbook's going to be involved in that as well. So with the cloud options these days, there's a multitude of areas you can restore that's easily accessible outside your organization. But if you think about your disaster recovery plan, it should be a controlled document. So there should be version controls on that, and you should be reviewing it on a regular basis with all the stakeholders in the business, and highlighting any risks that could need to change that recovery plan. But thinking about, when you're onboarding new applications and services, part of that onboarding process and even offboarding process is, do I need to change my DR plan or update my DR plan to incorporate this new service? When I'm rolling out, SaaS-based applications, cloud, moving workloads to the cloud, those sorts of things, DR should still be at the forefront of your thought process to say, okay, what do I need to do to protect this workload as I'm moving out of my data center? So with part of that plan as well, who are the stakeholders? Who are your key vendors? So from an IT side, who provides your comms? Who provides your telephony? Who are your third-party suppliers that you may need to rely on? Have you got some form of outsourced agreement? And are you using ComputerWorld's disaster recovery as a service platform? What are the contact numbers and the details for those? Because when you're in that situation, you need to think about failover. You need to think about who it is that needs to be informed, and have that process in place in that playbook to say, these are the steps and these are the people that are involved who can make that decision. And that goes back to just a quick point on recovery time objectives as well. So when we're talking about replication of data and things like that, it's easy to just think about, okay, I can get a really, really low RTO. I can get near continuous data replication now with a lot of technologies. So I'm talking, very minimal data loss and very quick recovery times as well. What you've got to think about is how long that process takes before you invoke DR. So if there's a consultative approach or consultation that needs to happen with key stakeholders, is that adding another 2 hours onto those RTOs? So if you're saying, okay, I've got this application needs to be recovered in 1 hour, but if it takes you 2 hours to make a decision, then you're not meeting that SLA. So it's important just to think about those as well. And who it is who can invoke DR. So who is the person that's got the responsibility to make that decision, to click the big red button or the big hand that used to be in VMware SRM to say, let's go, let's invoke this process.
You're completely right. And the disaster recovery scenarios that I've been involved with helping recover, the biggest challenge is always those last 2 points that you've mentioned there. Actually, who is going to make the decision, and how long does that decision take to be made? Because actually, when the button is clicked, if you're using something like Veeam or Zerto or even VMware SRM, that recovery process generally can get going very quickly. But normally, 9 times out of 10, when you are making that decision, you are signing up to not only have some loss of data, you're signing up to have some downtime, and often you can be kind of signing up to have future downtime as you recover those systems back to their original place. Not all the times, there's ways of mitigating against those things, but that's again all into the design consideration. And knowing those things first, having those documented up first is imperative to make sure that when the disaster does hit, and believe me, I've had some very panicked phone calls when this does happen at customers' sites, and more often than not, it doesn't happen. This is an insurance policy, but increasingly with ransomware, and when it does happen, there's a lot going on at those times that you need to be very clear and be able to go to something that's very prescript, that tells people what to do, who to contact, and how to do it by when.
Definitely. Just to sort of wrap up on that last piece is, in my mind, the easy part is the technology. Recovering workloads these days with the various technologies we've got available is pretty straightforward in the large parts. The challenging piece is about thinking about your staff. So how are your staff going to access the data in those scenarios that you're planning for? So if the building that you're in, assuming we're back in working offices again, if that building is compromised, how do staff get access to that data? Again, if everyone's working from home and we've got connectivity back into the primary site, and we're doing some form of, let's say, on-prem to a second site that we got, has that got the connectivity to support all of those remote users connected into that site if we needed to fail over? It's just understanding all the challenges around how we get our staff, our end users, the consumers of the data, access to this as well. And that's another big challenge.
Definitely, and it's always those kind of things that are the gotcha. You mentioned a good point there about accessing the data. Certainly, I've been involved with reviews for disaster recovery where all the systems are being recovered, but the VDI platform or the RDS platform isn't being recovered because it wasn't classified as an important system. So then you ask the question, well, so how are the users actually going to get on with their work? And all of a sudden, actually, something that was just classified as users' desktops, what does it matter? Well, it matters because it's all the users' desktops in one place. I've also worked with customers that have got a agreement in place with a data recovery center, and they say we've got 1,000 desktops ready to go at the disaster recovery center. You go, great. Are they preloaded with your client software for your ERP system so people can get going ASAP? Oh no, we didn't think about that. They've just got Windows 10 on it, kind of thing. It is just those little things that will be the thing that will hamper the plan. And as you say, it isn't all about technology. It's around people. It's around process. It's about informing people. Now, the other area that I'd really like to talk about is, because quite often when we talk about all of these things, we are talking about disaster recovery, hardware failure, flood, fire, all of these kind of things. And cyber attack, ransomware, people might go, yeah, well, I've got a DR plan, that's not a problem, and they haven't thought about particularly how they would respond in the event of a cyber incident. So in my mind, a cyber response plan will overlap with a DR plan, but equally will have a lot of different areas in it. I've kind of, in my thinking of this, there's at least 4 stages. There's the isolate phase. You find out something's going on. 2, 3, 4 machines have now got ransomware on it. A virus is going from machine to machine. So you're going to want to be thinking about, actually, how do I stop this? How can I isolate it? How can I make sure that we're protected today? And in those cyber incidents that I've been involved with, it's things like unplugging the internet. It's things like shutting all of the systems down. And whilst I understand that could be disastrous for the organization in the short term, it's better than data leaking or there being further downtime afterwards. Then once you're confident you've been able to isolate it, it's then the investigation stage. What happened? How did it happen? What data has been lost? Do I need to inform the relevant authorities that data has been lost? How am I going to make sure that what has happened can be reversed? So you can then get to the next phase, which is that remediation step, the step where you're kind of putting the things in place to make sure when you bring the systems back up, it doesn't happen all over again. If there was a hole in your firewall leading to a system that was infiltrated, that was then ransomware was applied, and all you do is recover the same system from a backup back to the same place without sorting the firewall rule, then that system is going to end up being attacked once again. So it is important in that cyber response plan that you include that remediation phase. And then once you're confident that you've isolated it, you know what was caused it, you've put the relevant remediation steps in place, you're going to then start recovering by some way, shape or form. And that might be at that point where your DR plan then comes into place. But maybe there are those initial steps that you do need to be considering before you even click the button to be booting up the system somewhere else. Because you could just actually be sending that ransomware or that virus somewhere else on your network by recovering it in DR.
Definitely. The way I like to think about it is the cyber crooks out there always thinking about how they can hack their networks, how they can compromise our data all of the time. And we need to have that same mindset, but how do we protect ourselves from them all of the time? So we need to be continually evolving and continually thinking about all of our risks and making sure they're all fully documented and reviewed on a regular basis. A lot of people say it's not, not if I get hit, it's when I'm going to get hit these days, because it's pretty easy now. Someone can click something, bring something in. There's so many smart people out there that can trick people into downloading this malware, whatever it is. It is a matter of time for most organizations, unfortunately, but having the right level of protection in place means the damage can be limited, which is a really important area to focus on.
Definitely. And I think there's a couple of areas there that we've spoken about the pressure in that moment. We've spoke about the decision-making process. There's a number of ways at Computerworld that we do help people with both of those. We offer a disaster recovery as a service solution, which doesn't only include the technology in partnership with our partners ILAM, but does include things like the testing, does include us on the end of the phone should a disaster occur to help you with that failover, that decision-making process. And also from a cyber response, we work with a company called SecureWorks, where they offer a monthly payment that you pay, that if something does happen, they are able to come in and help you with that isolate, investigate, remediate phase of that piece. And it is all important to make sure that you have truly got to the bottom of how did it happen and what happens, to make sure that you're meeting your obligations. So anything with recovery planning then, Ben, before we do a recap of our 5 points?
No, I think we've covered off most of the key parts there.
Fantastic. So to go over the 5 points that Ben and I have discussed on today. Number one, know what you're trying to protect and what you are protecting against. It's about that familiarization. It's about actually thinking about the different scenarios you may need to be recovering from. It's about bringing the business into that decision making and being able to fully document an agreement between IT and the business in the event of a DR, what is needed on an application or a service by service basis against the scenarios you're putting there. Number two then was leveraging the inherent security and protection features. If you've got VMware, if you've got Microsoft Cloud, if you've got even things like Active Directory, if you've got shared storage, if you've got switches and firewalls, all of these pieces of hardware, these components of your infrastructure will have protection features that are inherent to them. And whilst we wouldn't recommend a completely vanilla approach, just using those tools as your only protection method, they really can help you limit and mitigate the risk that is going to happen. And think further than just DR and backup. Think about those risk mitigation measures like DLP, like antivirus, like the tools that give you extra visibility into what's going on. Number three, then consider or maybe reconsider your data protection options and best practices. So you know what you're protecting against, you know what your services are, you know what you're protecting, you know what is available to you today. What are the gaps? Where do you need to be layering on different security and data protection measures? And how are you going to make sure that you're meeting all of the requirements against those different scenarios? Local protection, easy, quick recovery, long-term retention, recovery of virtual machines, as well as recovery of files. There's a number of different elements you're going to want to be thinking of, and likely to be leveraging services such as DR from a cloud provider or remote protection, like we're going to be talking about for the rest of today. Number four, whatever it is that you've put in place is only as good as the last time you tested. And if you didn't document it when you tested it, you didn't do the testing in itself. So put that time and effort in to do the testing, fully document it, learn your lessons, document those lessons. Think about the different test scenarios you might need to do and do it regularly and commit to it. Whilst I understand it can be very difficult in a business as usual world, it is imperative to make sure you've got those things in place. And then finally, plan for your recovery. Think more than just actually who's going to click the buttons, who's going to be making the decisions, how are we going to make those decisions, and all of those important elements, not just around disaster recovery, but cyber incident response and much more. So Ben, before we wrap up today, have you got any final thoughts, anything that maybe we haven't covered that you would urge people to think about when it comes to data protection?
I'm only going to say 2 words really, Barry: test and document.
Yeah.
You're doing that across all of those 5 key bullet points. I think is going to save yourself a world of pain in the future. You're only as good as your last test, and your documentation will be your saving grace because it's going to be tested. So when you're in that pressure scenario, the worst has happened, you need to get yourself out of the hole that you find yourself in. That's going to be your savior. So test and document.
Definitely. For me, 2 things that I'd like to share. Again, if you would like to discuss these things and others that are relevant to your business, scan the QR code on screen or speak to your computer or account manager. We'd love to come and talk about these subjects and others that are relevant to you to help you improve your data protection strategy. From our perspective, if we're working with someone and we hear that they've been hit by ransomware or hit by a disaster and they've not been able to recover, from our perspective, it feels quite disappointing because we want to help our customers make sure they're not in that scenario. And often they have the technology already. It's not about that large investment. It's about looking at it another way. And the second thing that I highly recommend, we've obviously got the sessions throughout the day that will help inform you on the different strategies and technologies that are available. But later on today, myself and Ben will be joined from people from Ireland and Veeam to have a panel discussion all around data recovery and protection. So join us for that session. You'll have the opportunity to submit your own questions, or we'll also be sending out some emails which you will have got in advance where you can reply about that as well. But thank you ever so much for joining us today. Ben, thank you for your time and energy into this session. And we look forward to talking to you all about your data protection needs in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.